Hi, my name is Olivia and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to film a reading vlog and I'm going to be attempting to read The Institute by Stephen King within a 24-hour period. This is part of my week-long Stephen King readathon and the corresponding vlog for that should already be up on my channel, so I'll link that up above if you're interested. But today I wanted to give you more of an in-depth look into my reading throughout the day and my thoughts on the book. This is a bit of a longer Stephen King book at just under 600 pages, although it doesn't even come close to something like it in length. It's also one of his more recent publications, and I haven't read many of his works that have been published since about 2010. As part of this readathon, I was hoping to be able to compare some of his older, more classic books, like The Shining and Pet Sematary, to some of his newer publications, and this is definitely one that I've had my eyes on for a while. The premise seems really interesting, and I'm curious to see how his writing has changed and evolved over the years. The book itself revolves around a little boy called Luke Ellis who has magical abilities, and it opens with some mysterious intruders coming into his home, killing his parents, and dragging him away into their car, taking him to a place known as the Institute. When he arrives there, he finds that there are many other children like him, with special abilities such as telekinesis and telepathy. The purpose of the Institute is to train them and hone their skills and abilities, but it's not really clear what they do after they graduate from the Institute, and what their powers are used for moving forward. The one thing that is clear right off the bat is that everyone is there against their wills. There's no option to leave and no clear way out. I find this setup to be incredibly interesting, and it doesn't immediately scream Stephen King to me. It doesn't sound like right off the bat it's going to have too many horror aspects to it. Maybe a little bit of a true crime vibe, because you're seeing some murders happen very early on at the beginning of the book. I'm well aware that Stephen King has repeatedly branched out in the past and written outside of the horror genre, but I haven't picked up any of his non-horror books to date, so I have no real background in how well he's able to write some of those other genres. I'm intrigued to see if this one is going to be primarily fantasy, or if it's going to dabble in horror a little bit, or even be a combination of the two. With that being said, I can't wait to get started with this readathon. It's currently a few minutes before 9 a.m., so I'm going to start it at 9 and go until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, and I'll try to update you with my progress along the way. But before we get into reading, let's make a quick cup of coffee.
A cup of coffee in the morning, and I get the paper. I check the...
It's about 10:30 and I've just reached page 63. So far this book has not been what I was expecting at all. One of the first things that immediately stood out to me is it appears like we're going to get a dual point of view in this book. Based on the plot summary alone, I was expecting just to get one perspective, the little boy whose parents are murdered and he's then carted off to the Institute. But for the first 45 to 50 pages, we're following a bit of an older man as he settles down in a new town and gets a job, and it's all part of his scheme on eventually traveling to New York and settling down there. I'm not really sure what his significance is or why we're getting so much detail into his background and his plans for the future. He didn't appear to be referenced at all in the plot summary, so I'm having trouble fitting together the pieces and figuring out what his role in this story is going to be ultimately. The original 50 pages or so that were told from his perspective were incredibly boring, which surprised me, especially for a Stephen King book. The opening pages and chapters seemed far too much of an info dump, and they gave way more information that I would have cared for about this individual, about his past, as well as about where he envisions himself in the future. To be completely upfront, it's been tough to slog through the beginning portion of this book. It's been incredibly slow, akin to watching paint dry. There's been nothing of consequence that's actually happened. We've watched a character settle down in a new town, find a job, and start his first handful of days on the job. He describes some of the people he interacts with on his day-to-day basis, and you also see a little bit into his routine. And that's about as interesting as it gets. It was only within the last 3 or 4 pages that I read that the plot actually picked up quite a bit, and you get to see some of the events referenced in the plot summary as they unfold. Based on what I've read so far, I think this opening was really an opportunity miss. Usually, Stephen King writes introductions that start the book off with a bang and draw me in immediately, pretty much from page 1. But that's definitely not the case for this one. It was a bit painful to drag myself through these opening chapters. I didn't care about the protagonist, and I didn't care about any of the events that were happening, the few that were present in the narrative. While the last handful of pages have started to pique my interest, I'm not sure if that's going to continue for the remainder of the book, or if it's going to be interspersed with some much slower sections, like what I just read 50 pages of. Needless to say, this one was not off to the start that I was expecting or hoping for. There's definitely a lot of room for improvement, but I'm willing to give the book that chance. So I want to keep reading, and I'll update again in a bit. It's now a few minutes after noon, and I've reached the 140-page mark. So far, this book has been all over the place with respect to pacing and the different points of view. The pacing has ranged from glacial at the very beginning of the book, when we were following the first perspective, to now suddenly very fast-paced, very exciting, and to the point that it's challenging to keep up as a reader. The more action-heavy, quicker scenes are also interspersed among some much slower and considerably more dull scenes, which is not a complaint that I typically have of Stephen King's books. The works of his that I've read previously have had pretty even paces. They weren't too erratic or bouncing back and forth between slow and quick, which is starting to be the case for this book, and I'm hoping it's not something that continues up through the very ends. Around the page 50 mark, we got some new action and some exciting scenes that I wasn't really anticipating. But since then, a lot of the hype and excitement has died down a bit. There's a lot of confusion regarding the Institute, the people working there, and what exactly is happening. And that's definitely seemed to take into the forefront of the book, at least for right now. Instead of this section being very action-driven, it seems like it's more question-driven. Our narrator is asking all of these questions and not really finding the answers. So he's going out in search of those on his own. And we're getting to follow along with that, but there's not really much he can do while he's locked in the Institute and constantly monitored. That's led to yet another lull in the pacing and the overall speed of the book. So this one is becoming more and more challenging to get through. Definitely more challenging than I had been anticipating. The fact that we have little to no answers has also been frustrating. If we were getting some information, a few details here and there being revealed, I think it would be even more captivating because it would keep me coming back for more and eager to figure out more of what's going on behind the scenes. But even that isn't the case for this book. We're still very much in the dark. We've been told a handful of things, but we don't know whether they're true or false, and we have no real way of verifying that at this point. All in all, so far, it's been frustrating and boomeranging back and forth between fast-paced and slow-paced, which wasn't what I was anticipating and certainly isn't going to win this one a 5-star rating, at least at the time being. I'm definitely interested to see where the plot is headed and how the premise is going to unfold from here, but I didn't picture it going exactly this way. I'm hoping the book will pick up in pacing, or at least become a little bit more steady in that regard in future chapters. Next, talking about the characters and the point of view, King started off the book from the perspective of an older gentleman who was making his way to New York City, moving slowly through the US, and finally settled down in the South, and found himself a job. King went into so much detail describing the individual's life, backstory, and his day-to-day routine, and we haven't heard from him since about page 50. Consequently, it's not been very apparent what his role is in this story. We haven't heard from him in almost 100 pages, and his storyline seemed to have little to no connection to the little boy who's serving as the focal point of the book. At this point, I have a lot of questions that have gone unanswered, including how these characters are connected and how their storylines will eventually become intertwined. Overall, this isn't my favorite start to a Stephen King novel, to say the least, but I'm not going to write it off just yet. So I'm going to get back into reading, and I'll update again in a few hours. I grabbed some lunch, and I've been reading for the past 2.5 hours or so. I just reached the 200-page mark, and I think I can finally put my finger on something that's been bothering me so far throughout the book. The big thing that's really stood out to me ever since the perspective shifted and we got to see things from the point of view of the little boy, who's the central focus of the story, it very much came across as children speaking much more like adults. All of the children's voices didn't match their ages. They were very, very far off from what I would have expected. For example, the protagonist, who's narrating this portion of the book, is described as a 12-year-old genius. But when he talks and you get to read his inner monologue, he acts like he's 30 years old and is very well wise beyond his years. I can understand having additional knowledge that sets him apart from his peers, but I would still expect him to talk and speak like a 12-year-old's. This has also been the case for many of the other children that we've been introduced to so far. They're all acting like adults and speaking like adults. I think a big contributing factor to that is that at the Institute, they have a series of vending machines. And in those machines, they offer cigarettes, alcohol, and even weed. Each of the children is allowed to redeem tokens at these vending machines, and there's no regulations. Theoretically, a 5 or 6-year-old could get out any of these items and begin consuming them. I think Stephen King has very much taken all of these adult themes and adult conversations and scenes, and he's tried to force children into these roles. To make matters worse, there are even a few characters who are acting younger than their true age. For example, a 10-year-old little boy acts more like he's 5. This has resulted in a big, confusing mess of characters and their ages. In my mind, most of these characters are far older than they're written or than Stephen King intended, and I'm having a lot of trouble changing that to adjust it so that it fits King's description. This seems like something that's going to continue for the rest of the book, especially because it's been so prevalent so far. I can't see King doing an abrupt switch partway through and giving these children more childlike qualities and voices and perspectives. It's something that I'm hoping will improve, but I think there's a very slim chance that it actually will. On a different note, both the plot and the pacing have improved. There's much more suspense now, and there's been growing tension over the past 50 or so pages, and I think that's helped to further the plot and keep me interested and engaged. There are so many uncertainties and unknowns, even at this point in the book. I feel like we've gotten very few answers throughout the entire narrative, so that's definitely kept me on the edge of my seat and wanting to read more, despite the children that don't actually act like children. With that, I'm going to read for a few more hours, grab some dinner, and then my only plans for tonight are getting further through this one. I'm feeling pretty confident that I can finish this up by 9 a.m. tomorrow and successfully complete my 24-hour readathon. That's it for now, and I'll check in again in a bit. It's about 5:30 and I just reached the 320 page mark. At just over halfway through the book, all of the different plot lines and storylines are finally starting to come together and make a little bit more sense as to how they all tie into one cohesive story. This was something that I had been very skeptical of when the book first started out. I had no idea how these seemingly unrelated characters would eventually cross paths. But in true Stephen King fashion, they did in the most unpredictable of ways. I'm just barely getting to see a glimpse into how all of these different characters and their stories intertwine, and I think it's only going to unfold and get more complex from here. So it's something that I'm actually looking forward to reading more about. King is a mastermind at setting up these incredibly intricate stories with lots of moving parts and lots of characters to distract you from what's actually going on. I think that's definitely the case for this book. I clearly have little to no idea what's going on or what's going to happen next. And that helps to build a good sense of suspense that adds to some of the horror aspects. On that note, the horror scenes in particular have been pretty few and far between. Don't get me wrong, the ones that have been included have been truly horrifying and have made my blood run cold at times, but there haven't been that many of them, which was a little surprising, especially coming from Stephen King. It's definitely much more of a slow burn and psychologically torturing book, instead of outright graphic violence and horrifying scenes. The fact that most of these characters are children helps to add to those terrifying components of the book. So this book is definitely geared more toward psychological and behind-the-scenes horror. Much of it is implied instead of shown, which I think is interesting, especially for Stephen King. It seems like he's definitely breaking the mold, at least from some of his older books, and I'm actually enjoying what he's tried to do with this one. With respect to the plot and pacing, they've both slowed down considerably again. The book was off to a slow start. There were about 75 pages of very fast-paced action, and it slowed right back down again. I think a lot of that has to do with the adventure that one of the characters is embarking on. It reminds me a lot of the first Lord of the Rings book, where the protagonist went on a journey and never really seemed to get to his final destination. You just saw a lot of scenes of him continuing to travel on this adventure. I'm getting a lot of those vibes in the Institute at the moment, and I'm dreading that a little bit. That was one of the main reasons that I couldn't get through that first book in the Lord of the Rings series. It felt like nothing was getting accomplished, and there are only so many times that you can read about a character going on a journey before it becomes very, very dull. Needless to say, I'm hoping it'll pick back up again soon. It's now about 9:30 p.m., so please excuse the lighting. This is the best I could do with what I have to work with. I just reached the 400-page mark, which means I'm very quickly nearing the end of this one. I only have about 150 pages left, and I'm very confident that I can finish that by 9 a.m. tomorrow, making this a successful 24-hour readathon. The last 100 pages or so have definitely changed my opinion on this book, for the better, without a doubt. The very slow start that took me a little bit by surprise and wasn't too impressing at first glance is turning out to have some real payoffs. In hindsight, I love what Stephen King decided to do with that and how he decided to intertwine all of the different storylines and plot lines. It makes a lot more sense on the flip side, and it definitely wasn't something that I could appreciate when I was first starting the book. Well, I think that type of introduction set up the rest of the book very, very well, and I wouldn't have changed that aspect of it. I can see how it could dissuade some readers. You're starting a book and the first 50 or so pages are dull, boring, and very slow to get through. That would be a quick DNF in my mind. In fact, if this wasn't a Stephen King book, I likely would have considered DNFing it myself. So I think it's a tough balance that Stephen King was trying to strike here. And for me, it was successful, but I don't think that's going to be the case for 100% of readers. If you're not so sure about this one and are thinking about giving it a try, please try to push through and get past those first 50 pages. It really does pick up and improve from there, even though it can be a little slow going to get to a more fast-paced and exciting portion of the book. Moving on from the introduction, I'm very much loving the characterization, especially the fact that we're getting to see characters on both the good and the evil sides in this case. Those that are working for the Institute and the children that are being kept there against their wills. As a reader, having the chance to view this setup from both sides really helps me to sympathize with and understand where each and every one of the characters is coming from. And it makes the story that much more realistic, as you get to see each character's past and the things that they're currently dealing with and struggling with. You get to see those come to light and how they're impacting their present-day decisions. It also makes the caregivers and employees at the Institute more than just a nameless, faceless evil. You get the sense that some of them aren't happy with the jobs that they're being asked to fulfill, whereas others actually relish those positions that they're holding. So you definitely see a dichotomy, even among individuals who are seemingly on the same side of this equation. This leads to very well-written and thoroughly planned out villains, which is one of Stephen King's strengths. In just about every book of his that I've read so far, I've always commented on the villains and how much I've enjoyed reading about them and how thoroughly convincing they are. I think the part that makes it even more frightening is that many of these villains have rationales and thought processes that readers can at least somewhat understand and somewhat side with. Maybe if put in a similar situation, readers would have chosen some of the same decisions. And I think that's one of the most terrifying aspects of the book. You really get to see how one or two questionable decisions snowball into something that's much more out of control and much more than these characters originally bargained for. This really helps to establish a sinister and eerie tone. It's hard to distinguish between characters that made one or two poor choices and got themselves caught up in something that was way more than they had anticipated, versus those characters who are sort of orchestrating everything behind the scenes and the major players that are responsible for what's unfolding. Some of these characters are truly evil, whereas others seem like they were just caught in a tough situation and didn't have many great choices available to them. This has really made many of the villains, or seemingly villainous characters, that much more complex, three-dimensional, and believable. Looking at the children, they're still not quite acting their ages. Some of them are acting far older, some of them are acting far younger. And I think that's something that's pretty much going to be the case for the remainder of the book. I can't see it drastically changing in the last 150 pages or so. The Institute also contains quite a few references to Stephen King's other books, even ones that I've been able to pick up on based on the few other Stephen King works that I've read. I think the most notable similarities are to It, especially with the sense of camaraderie and all of the friendships between the different children. On top of that, there's also a set of twins in this book, which very much reminded me of the twins from The Shining. So there are definitely quite a few references, and I'm sure there are even some that I haven't picked up on yet. With respect to the plot and the pacing, both have started to improve at this point in the book. They've definitely evened out, and there's much less zigzagging back and forth between fast-paced and very slow-paced. The plot itself is reminding me more and more of a YA book. We're following very young children, about middle school aged for the most part, and we're getting to see the challenges and struggles that they're encountering at the Institute. If it weren't for all of the very graphic and violent scenes in this book, I think it would very well be classified as a young adult book. But because of Stephen King's very descriptive horror, I don't think this would be a great read for younger audiences. I think it was definitely the safer and better decision to market it as an adult, but the plot does feel very reminiscent of many other YA books. Therefore, this might be an easy book to pick up for someone who's looking to transition from young adult horror into adult horror. It definitely bridges that gap, and I think there could be arguments that it could fall into young adult or adult. With only 150 pages left, I'm going to try to get a little more reading done tonight, and then wrap it up first thing tomorrow morning. This is probably my last update for tonight, but I'll be sure to check in again tomorrow. It's the next day around 7 a.m. Last night before I fell asleep, I managed to get to page 460. I still have about 90 pages left in the book, but something that's confusing me a little bit is that it seems like most of the action and the main plot line is starting to get wrapped up. It seems like the climax has already come and gone. There was a huge exciting scene that we were building up to for most of the book, and it seems like we're very much on the tail end of that. So I'm a little confused as to how this book is going to stretch out for almost 100 more pages. This is something that I've picked up on and questioned in other Stephen King books in the past. It seems like he unnecessarily draws out a lot of his endings and adds on extra information and extra details that weren't essential and didn't really tie up any of the questions or loose threads that were introduced earlier in the book. If anything, those additional 50 plus pages at the very end of his novels seem to introduce brand new plot points and brand new things to think about. That type of setup for a book is definitely outside of the norm, especially for something that could be classified as a horror or thriller. In this book in particular, it seems like he's really pushing to get out those extra 100 pages. I could see maybe having 30 or 40 more pages to tie up a few of the questions that haven't been answered yet, but there aren't that many to warrant this number of pages remaining in the book. It also seemed like the growing suspense and tension was going to amount to something larger than the climax that we actually got. The climax itself was 15 to 20 pages at the most, which was far shorter than I was anticipating. There was such a long build-up to this point in the book that it felt like a bit of a letdown and disappointment to have all of those loose threads wrapped up in a single scene that couldn't have been more than 20 pages. It very much felt like a flood of frantic and hectic activity, and now everything's kind of died down and the characters are just looking at one another in confusion in the aftermath. Unless the ending improves considerably and those last 90 pages are able to suddenly win me over, I have to say this ending was disappointing and was far from my expectations. Both the premise of this book and the preceding 400 pages both had a lot of potential, and I was sucked into the different plot lines that were introduced. But to see them tied up in this way at the very end is definitely a letdown and not what I was anticipating. It's definitely a recurring theme in Stephen King books that the endings tend to be his weakness, and I think that's turning out to be the case for this one. I don't want to write it off entirely before I finished it, but I'm not feeling too optimistic about the last 100 pages or so. There are a few plot lines that still need to be resolved, but still, I don't think they're going to take that long to do it. If Stephen King does truly take that long to tie up all of these loose ends, I think it's going to be painful and unnecessarily long and drawn out, which is going to make this end even more disappointing. I think I've harped on that enough, you've probably gotten the point, so let's talk about some of the horror aspects in the book, which are still few and far between. I'm a little disappointed by that as well. I was expecting more horrifying, terrible scenes to show up, but at most we've gotten a few gunfights and some gunshot wounds. Nothing true Stephen King horror, or at least what I would consider Stephen King horror. Earlier on in the book, we got more of those psychological, slow burn, thrilling aspects, but we haven't seen any true horror scenes since about the 200 or 300 page mark. It's been pretty lackluster overall with respect to terrifying or frightening scenes, and it definitely doesn't read like a Stephen King horror. While this book definitely had potential at the very beginning, I'm having trouble seeing how it's going to wrap up in a good way, and a way that's able to win me over and change my mind about some of the things that I haven't been crazy about so far. I have about 2 hours left of my readathon, so I'm going to power through these last 90 pages, and I'll update again probably once I've finished the book. It's now 8:45 in the morning, and I've officially finished The Institute by Stephen King. Ultimately, this ending was a very large letdown. I think from the start of the book, the premise was intriguing, and it was set up decently, if not very well, but it really fell flat in the execution about 3/4 of the way through the book. For one, the climax popped up way too early in the story. It was over and done in the course of about 20-25 pages, so there really wasn't a whole lot of suspense after that had wrapped up. But there were still about 100 pages left in the book, and I think those easily could have been cut down to 3 or 4 pages at the most. They were dull, slow going, and pretty challenging to get through. I really had to force myself to the end of this book. I think Stephen King put way too much effort and emphasis into tying up every single possible loose end before the book was over. I could have done with a little bit of ambiguity and a few loose ends that weren't completely addressed or resolved. I would have actually looked forward to that, having sort of that food for thought after you finish the book, of wondering what happened to a specific character or a specific plot point that wasn't fully wrapped up. I think it would have added a bit more suspense back into the end of the book, where it was definitely lacking in the way it was written. I also found that once I had gotten to this point in the book and already surpassed the climax, I didn't really care about the characters and what ended up happening to them. It seemed like the biggest dangers and threats had already come and gone, so there wasn't too much that made me question which characters were making it out alive and which were not. Overall, the story seemed very resolved about 100 pages before it actually ended. I really would have enjoyed seeing it cut off before those 100 pages, and those even could have been summarized in a sentence or two. It would have had the same effect and would have had a much more entertaining and quick and succinct ending. So now, just to provide a quick overview on my thoughts on the book as a whole, it was off to a slow and a bit of a rocky start. The middle was decent, it really picked up in the pacing and caught my interest, and then the ending of the book was also very lackluster. Consequently, I'm giving this one a 3 out of 5 stars. I think there was a lot of potential, especially in the premise and the plot points that Stephen King decided to focus on, but I think he really fell short and chose some avenues that I wasn't really interested in reading about. There were a few alternatives that I really would have preferred, and I wish that he had done a few things differently. On a similar note, the pacing was a little bit all over the place. We had some very, very slow sections of the book, sandwiched in between some very exciting and action-packed scenes. There didn't really seem to be any method to the madness, and it was challenging to figure out whether the next section that you were starting was going to be action-packed or you were going to have trouble keeping your eyes open. I would have much preferred pacing that was more even throughout the course of the book. I could see starting off a little bit slower and building in your pacing as you're also building tension at the same time, but that definitely wasn't the case in this book. It seesawed back and forth between the two extremes and was very rarely in that sweet middle ground. I found this frustrating, and it made it challenging to engage in the book and connect with each of the characters. Had I not been reading this for a vlog, I very well may have skimmed through a few of the slower sections that tended to drag a bit. I don't think that really would have impacted the story overall. I can see that Stephen King was trying to put the time toward the world building and the character building, but they weren't that strong and that solid in the book overall. It seemed like he was taking a lot of time to accomplish these things and wasn't really getting much benefit out of it. So I would have preferred if he had just shortened the book and left out those components that he was trying to build up over the course of the narrative. Talking about the characters, I really had trouble connecting with each of them. There are a few different perspectives. One is from a child's perspective, and he's the child that's referenced in the plot summary, where his home is invaded, his parents are kidnapped, and he's taken off to the Institute because he has some type of powers. While you're following him around the Institute, you get to see his interactions with the other children that are there. And one thing that immediately stood out to me from the very first time that each of these characters were introduced was that they were 7, 8, 9, sometimes even 10 and 11-year-olds that were acting like full-blown adults. Their dialogue, their actions, and their thought processes did not correspond with those of a child. And it was really off-putting and confusing, especially when I was first reading those scenes where they're introduced. For many of these individuals, we were explicitly told their ages. But if that had been excluded from the narrative, I very well would have said that some of these characters were in their 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s. They seemed to have worldly experiences well beyond their years. They were far more intuitive and intelligent than the average child. And they were also incredibly motivated, and their actions didn't really match up with what I would expect from a child. That definitely took away from the realistic and believable aspects of the book and really drew me out of the story. It was capturing my attention in a negative way. I think if Stephen King wanted to utilize some of the same conversations and scenes, he should have changed the ages to correspond more with someone who is an adult. That would have made far more sense in the context of the book, and it wouldn't have drawn my attention in such a negative light. It was something that once I noticed it, I couldn't unnotice it, and I kept picking up in more and more cases of it happening later on in the book. But if you're able to get over that aspect of the writing and either ignore the ages or ignore their actions and speech, then I would say this very well may be a 4 or 5-star read for you. With respect to the plot and where it ultimately headed, I very much enjoyed those components of the book. I think it was well executed, minus some pacing inconsistencies, and it was interesting and original. It really kept me hooked for most of the book, excluding the very ending, and I was interested to see what was going to happen next and how the characters were going to get themselves out of quite a few predicaments. It was a fun, entertaining, and relatively light read plot-wise, especially for a Stephen King book. It was a pretty quick read, and I flew through it very fast in under 24 hours. I did take quite a bit of time out to sleep, make some meals, and relax a little bit in between reading. So I wasn't reading the full period, and I managed to finish it pretty comfortably within that time. Now let's talk a little bit about the horror, or the overall lack thereof. The premise itself has some horror aspects to it. It's shocking, startling, and a little bit terrifying, but most of that is present in the plot summary. You do get to see those scenes unfold in the narrative, but those are some of the spookiest scenes in the book overall. The remainder of the book, you'd get the occasional spooky scene here or there, maybe a total of 4 or 5 additional scenes above and beyond the very opening. These scenes I didn't find truly terrifying. They were more of a slow burn psychological horror instead of violence, outright hack and slash, or some sort of torture happening. Therefore, it was a much slower burn with respect to the horror than I was anticipating. It didn't seem to match up with previous Stephen King books that I've read, especially looking at things like Misery and The Shining, where I remember being outright horrified and terrified by certain scenes. I'd really been able to insert myself into those scenes, and it felt like I was experiencing everything alongside the characters. But that wasn't the case for The Institute. This book very much felt like I was just a bystander, simply watching things unfold. Therefore, the horrifying aspects of the book were definitely far below what I was expecting. But if you're looking for an introduction to the genre and an introduction to Stephen King horror, this might be a great place to start, because it does have a lot of other elements that are found in other genres, like fantasy. And lastly, I feel like I have to address the fact that this read far more like a YA book than an adult. And I think this may have been due to the toned down and relatively minimal horror. We were also following a cast of characters who were primarily children, and you're seeing the world through their eyes and their actions and thoughts. So it very much read like it was something geared toward a younger audience. I think if Stephen King's name wasn't on the front of this book, it would have been marketed toward young adults, teens, maybe people in their early 20s. I couldn't see it going for an all-adult audience if Stephen King's name wasn't printed on the front. So if you're thinking of picking this one up, that may be something to keep in mind. If you're generally not a fan of YA, I would probably skip this one and pick up a different Stephen King. On the flip side, if you love YA and maybe you want to start transitioning to adult with a bit of a spooky theme and some spooky tropes, then this might be a great read to pick up. Unfortunately, I was looking for more of that adult hardcore horror. I didn't find myself truly scared by this book, and it was a bit of a letdown with respect to the pacing, the characters, and the overall lack of terrifying scenes that actually made me fearful of what was going on. It's definitely not Stephen King's strongest book, and it probably wasn't for me. I'm definitely not the ideal audience for this, and I recognize that, so that probably did play into my rating quite a bit. It wasn't a horrible book by any means, and I think there is an audience out there who would really enjoy this book. And that wraps up my reading vlog. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read this one, or you're planning to read it, and tell me any thoughts that you had while you were reading. Also, let me know what Stephen King books I should pick up next. I'm still trying to read through all of his works, and making pretty slow progress. So I need some recommendations down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.